Rusted fishing trawlers sitting upright in the sand, 50 kilometers from the nearest water. Their hulls still intact, their anchors still set, their paint peeling in a wind that carries salt and pesticide from a seabed that has been exposed to the sun for 40 years. Around them, nothing. No harbor, no dock, no town. Just a white crust of toxic sediment stretching to the horizon in every direction, and the sound of wind moving across a desert that did not exist when these boats were launched. This was the Aral Sea, the fourth largest lake on Earth. 68,000 square kilometers of water fed by two of the largest rivers in Central Asia, home to 24 species of fish, 40,000 tons of annual catch, and tens of thousands of families who had lived on its shores for generations. In the 1950s, Soviet planners looked at the rivers that fed the lake and made a decision that would erase it from the map. They diverted the water to grow cotton. Within 3 decades, the lake had lost 90% of its volume. The fishing industry collapsed. The ports were stranded. The towns were abandoned. And what was exposed at the bottom of the vanished sea was so dangerous that it began killing people who lived hundreds of kilometers away. This is the story of how a country drained a sea, discovered what was underneath, and then built a wall to put the water back. In the 1950s, the Aral Sea held more than 1,000 cubic kilometers of water. 2 rivers fed it. Soviet planners looked at those rivers and saw cotton. Nikita Khrushchev declared that nature would bend to the will of the state. Engineers dug 30,000 kilometers of canals across the Central Asian steppe, built 45 dams, and redirected both rivers into the desert. The cotton grew. The lake started to empty. 90% of the canal network was unlined, with trenches cut straight into loose sand. Between 30 and 75% of diverted water never reached a crop. It seeped into the ground or evaporated into the air. To compensate, they diverted more. By the 1980s, the flow from both rivers into the Aral Sea had dropped to 0. The death spiral was immediate. Shallower water absorbs more heat. Warmer water evaporates faster. Every year, the lake shrank. It became easier to shrink more. In 1987, it split in 2, the smaller North Aral in Kazakhstan, the larger South Aral in Uzbekistan. By the early 2000s, the eastern basin of the South Aral had vanished entirely, leaving nothing but a salt flat. 60,000 square kilometers of seabed were exposed. It was the fastest creation of a desert in recorded history. They named it the Aralcum. It was not sand. It was poison. 40 years of cotton farming had flushed fertilizer, pesticide, herbicide, and chemical defoliant into the lake. The chemicals settled into the sediment at the bottom. When the water vanished, that sediment dried into a toxic white crust laced with DDT, lindane, cadmium, and zinc. Then the wind picked it up. 10 major storms per year swept 20 to 75 million tons of toxic dust into the atmosphere. It landed on glaciers in the Pamir Mountains. It settled on fields in Iran. It entered the lungs of children in villages that had never been near the sea. In Karakalpakstan, the region closest to the dried basin, respiratory illness, kidney disease, and throat cancer surged. Infant mortality reached alarming levels. And there was something worse. An island called Vozrojdeniya had sat in the middle of the Aral Sea. The Soviet military had used it to test anthrax, plague, and smallpox in open-air experiments. When the Union collapsed, the canisters were buried, and the ground doused with bleach. As the lake shrank, the island became a peninsula, then part of the mainland. The pathogens were no longer isolated by water. In 2001, American defense specialists visited and found the cleanup had been incomplete. The Aral Sea had been hiding all of this beneath its surface. When the water was removed, the hidden world it exposed was not ancient ruins. It was concentrated poison. 4 decades of industrial chemicals and Cold War bioweapons, sealed by water and now released into the open air. What the lake had hidden was so dangerous that a country decided to put the water back. In 1992, a mayor named Alembay Balgimbayev in the town of Aralsk, did something the government called absurd. The North Aral was smaller and deeper than the south, and the Syr was still feeding it a trickle of water. But every drop that entered the northern basin immediately drained south through a narrow channel called the Berg Strait and evaporated, a bathtub with the plug pulled. Balgambayev and a group of local engineers decided to plug it themselves. They had no budget. They had no reinforced concrete. They had no permission from the national government. They loaded hundreds of dump trucks with sand, soil, and rubble and drove them straight into the strait, dumping material into the water to build a crude dike across 13 kilometers of open channel. The trucks ran day and night. The drivers worked in shifts. When a section of the dike settled or washed out, they drove more loads in to replace it. The government dismissed them as amateurs. The press ignored them entirely. The water level in the North Aral began to rise. Fish appeared. Moisture softened the air. For 7 years, the sand dike held. Then, in the spring of 1999, a flash flood overwhelmed the barrier. The sand wall crumbled. 2 workers were killed. 7 years of accumulated water rushed south and evaporated. Everything reset to zero. But the World Bank was watching. The failure of the sand dike proved that the concept was sound. The water had risen. The fish had returned. The only thing that had failed was the material. In 2001, the World Bank and the government of Kazakhstan approved an $86 million project to replace the sand dike with a permanent structure. The Kokaral Dam, 13 kilometers of compacted earth reinforced with high-strength concrete, was completed in August 2005. It sealed the Berg Strait permanently, trapping every drop of Syr water in the North Aral Basin. International engineers estimated it would take 3 to 5 years for the North Aral to reach its target depth of 42 meters. They were wrong. It took 7 months. By early 2006, the water level had risen over 3 meters. The volume surged from 14 billion to 27 billion cubic meters. The shoreline that had retreated 100 kilometers advanced back across the sand, swallowing the exposed seabed, covering the toxic crust, and stopping just 25 kilometers from the city of Aralsk. The water was coming home. What happened next was something the biologists did not expect. The recovery of the ecosystem happened on its own. No fish were transplanted, no plants were seeded, no biological intervention was carried out. The engineers fixed the water, and the water fixed everything else. As the dam flushed concentrated salt south through a 9-gate spillway system and retained fresh water from the river, salinity in the North Aral dropped from over 30 grams per liter to roughly 8 grams per liter. Below 10 grams per liter, freshwater fish eggs can survive. The chemical threshold was crossed, and the biology restarted itself. 22 fish species that had retreated upstream into the Sirdarya rushed back into the lake. Pike, perch, bream, carp, and roach began multiplying at a rate that stunned the monitoring teams. The fishing industry, which had produced 0 tons of catch for decades, climbed to over 8,000 tons per year. 12 fish processing plants were built along the coast. 3,000 fishermen returned to work. Coastal villages that had been reduced to a handful of elderly residents saw their populations triple. Young people who had left for the cities packed their bags and came back. A reverse migration that had never been seen in the history of Central Asia. Seafood from the North Aral passed international safety standards and began exporting to markets in Europe and Asia. 300 species of migratory birds returned to the shore. Coastal vegetation spread across thousands of hectares of formerly barren ground. The local climate itself began to shift as the expanding surface area of the lake increased humidity and moderated the temperature extremes that had made the region nearly uninhabitable. The village of Tastubek tells the story in miniature. In the 1990s, it was a ghost town. A few old men sat in empty houses, waiting for nothing. The sea was gone. The fish were gone. The young had left. Today, the boats are back in the water. The nets are out. The processing plants are running. The families have returned. A school that had closed reopened. A clinic that had been abandoned was restaffed. The village did not just survive. It came back to life because the water did. Kazakhstan did not stop. The government is now implementing Phase 2, a plan to raise the Kokaral Dam by 2 to 4 meters, pushing the water level from 42 to 46 meters. If successful, the volume will grow from 27 billion to 34 billion cubic meters. The surface area will expand by another 1,000 square kilometers. 167 engineering projects are underway across the entire Sir basin, lining canals with concrete, installing sensors to monitor every drop, and subsidizing farmers to switch to drip irrigation. The goal is to save 500 million cubic meters of lost water per year and redirect it into the North Aral. And there is one number that matters more than any other. At 46 meters, the water line will reach the rusted cranes and abandoned docks of the port city of Aral Sea. For the first time in over 50 years, the city that was stranded in the desert will become a coastal city again. Fishing boats that were photographed sitting in sand, the most iconic images of the disaster, will be surrounded by water. But when you stand on the Kokaral Dam and look south, the other half of the story is still there. The South Aral is gone. The Amu Darya is still being consumed by Uzbekistan's cotton fields. The eastern basin has dried completely. Natural gas infrastructure is being built on the exposed lakebed. The Aralkum Desert continues to produce toxic dust storms that reach communities hundreds of kilometers away. The biological weapons site at Vozrojdenia is accessible by foot. A 13-kilometer concrete wall created two completely opposite ecological outcomes on either side of it. To the north, life coming back. To the south, irreversible collapse. The Aral Sea will never return to what it was. 68,000 square kilometers of water have vanished permanently. The South Aral is beyond recovery in any foreseeable timeline. That truth cannot be softened. But in the north, a wall of concrete and earth, built on the ruins of a sand dike that was built by a mayor and a group of engineers who were told they were wasting their time, has brought a dead sea back to life. The fish returned on their own. The birds returned on their own. The people returned on their own. All anyone had to do was put the water back. The boats that sat in the sand for 40 years are still there. Some of them are rusting in water again. The sea is rising around their hulls. The sand that buried their anchors is sinking back beneath the surface. And in the villages along the shore, the children who play on the waterfront have never known a time when the sea was not there. Their grandparents remember. Their grandparents remember everything. Thanks for watching. If this is the kind of exploration you want to follow, please subscribe. There is more to come.